Hello, everyone. This is the latest in my series of the not so dismal science of economics. It's been a while since I've posted a video, but here we go. I'm Professor Philip Soren. I'm Professor of Economics at the University of Winnipeg. And today I want to talk a little bit more about trade policy, given that trade seems to be a never-ending topic of discussion. Today I want to focus on the relationship in the US between manufacturing employment and real GDP growth and imports versus exports. So the question is, what is the Trump administration strategy regarding trade policy? Well, as I said in earlier videos, the goal is really to change the structure of the US economy, or in some ways, attempt to restore the balance in the US economy between what has been over time a movement towards a service and finance type economy, still with some significant agriculture, but a reduction in manufacturing employment over time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you some data on what's happened to manufacturing employment in the US over time. So if you just hold on, I'll share the screen. So what we can see here is that we have the manufacturing data, and we have several columns here. So we have from the year 1979 to 2022. So what we have is we have in this column, we have real GDP growth in the US, and we have the share of exports in US GDP, and we have the share of imports in US GDP. So the difference is between this, we have imports minus exports was the difference between the share. And if we also look in terms of the overall share of employment of manufacturing in the US, you can see what's happened. From 1979, manufacturing was 18.51% of total jobs in the US economy. So that here, this column here, that's 104 million jobs. And so in 1979, there were so this is in thousands, so that's that's 104 million. That was 19 million jobs in manufacturing. So roughly 18% of the jobs were in manufacturing in 1979. So you can see what's happened over time is that there's been a secular decline in manufacturing, both in the share, obviously, there's been a reduction in total manufacturing jobs from close to 18.51% to 7.77%. So there's been a huge reduction in manufacturing jobs. So the question is, how do you account for that? Well, what I did is I just did a simple regression to try to uncover the relationship. Now, if I was going to do this for an academic paper, I might spend a little bit more time thinking about some of these issues, but this gives us sort of a rough guide of what's going on in terms of the relationship. So what I've done here, so this is a simple graph between the log of manufacturing employment and versus the difference between the share of imports and the share of exports. So you can see just with one regressor, which is the difference between the share of imports and share of exports, you see that there's a negative relationship between log of manufacturing and imports. So basically, this is saying that the larger the share of GDP, which is imports, the lower will be the manufacturing employment. But what I did here is I did a simple regression from 1979 to 2022, which is the data that was available. and I ran a simple regression with on the dependent variable was this case. In this case here, we have in terms of share. So this is the share of imports versus the share of imports. But there's also another regression result here that I want to show you. So you can see this is quite interesting, which says that obviously with real GDP growth, you get more manufacturing employment. So for each 1 percentage point in GDP growth, you get 0.029 percentage point increase in manufacturing. But notice what happens. The larger the imports over export share, you get this significantly larger adverse effect on manufacturing employment. And so we can also look, I think I've got one here with numbers. So let's see, where am I? Going back here. Where can I find it? Back. Let's see. Yeah, it's on another one. But in some sense, what you can do, so just hold on a sec if I can find another one. Well, I'll stop sharing for now. Stop share. So really what's going on here is that the U.S., the Trump administration is really looking at import replacement because, and when you look at the data, obviously, if the export content of the U.S. economy was manufacturing based, then in general, you might say, okay, well, we still want to have robust trade between, say, the U.S. and other countries, but it looks like most of the exports of the U.S. are not manufacturing based. Or another way of saying that is most of their imports are manufacturing, are in the manufacturing area. So it's easy to see that the more open the U.S. economy is, the more manufacturing will be at risk. So in other words, there'll be continued contraction in manufacturing employment because of the imports. So what does that mean? Well, the one thing that people always underestimate is often you think of a country like Canada or you think of another small open economy and you think, well, trade is very, very important to those economies. But trade is usually only a small fraction of the U.S. economy because it's so large. Lots of the GDP is generated internally. So the international side, in terms of if you think about the contribution to GDP in the U.S., it's roughly in the 15% range, and it's never been a huge component of the U.S. GDP. So trade has never been that important to the U.S. economy. So what does that mean? Well, that means that the U.S. in some sense can withstand a trade war much easier than other countries because trade as itself is not that important to them as it say is to Canada or maybe Australia or other smaller open economies. So I think this issue of how to respond to the Trump administration's tariff policy is not to forget that historically the U.S. has been a fairly closed economy. And the reason for that is because if you're a large economy, you can almost get to economies of scale in lots of industries. Or another way of saying that is also that because of the size of the economy, they're able to produce a wide variety of products without losing scale economies. So I think countries that are thinking of retaliating against the US have to realize that you're trying to retaliate against a well-diversified, large economy that is efficient in lots of industries or could be even more efficient in lots of industries because it has an internal market size which is big enough to get to economies of scale in lots of industries. The one thing, though, that they are vulnerable against is imports provide a useful discipline function for internal markets. Imports can replace internal competitors. So, for example, suppose you have a couple of firms or 3 or 4 firms in an industry, but there's no imports. Well, then usually the evidence suggests that the prices will be a little bit higher than you might like. But if you have a potential importer, then that can provide additional competition. So imports have a number of functions. They can also help discipline the internal markets and get you closer to a competitive setting in those areas. So I hope you found this useful. As I say, there's lots of issues that arise with the Trump policy in terms of trade, and I think that there'll be many more to come. But for now, I'll sign off and join you in the future. And if you're interested in this video, give it a like. And if you like this series, subscribe.